I'm just going to do a quick introduction and but for those that don't know us, I'm James Bedford, Scates Francis, academic skills, and I've moved over to UNSW College, but when I made this workshop, I was at UNSW. So in the role of the ALF, academic learning facilitators, and our day-to-day job was like helping students understand and navigate the process of studying at universities in a nutshell. And this workshop that we've come up with is sort of drawn on a lot of teaching that we've done in a Gen Ed program that we co-designed, which is Gen Y, something that we've been teaching for a while now. We'll talk about. So this is sort of kind of the second part of that session, and it's something that we weren't really aware that we were doing. The pedagogy in terms of transparency, something that came out of showcasing the teaching that we're doing, and then we sort of realized, oh, we're doing that. So we're still we're not experts in transparency in learning and teaching as a pedagogy by any means. I was doing my literature review about a week ago, so still learning what it means. But some of the practices that we've come up with, I think we've seen are very successful and have proven to be like resonating with students. So we wanted to kind of share this with you and hear from you and be able to some of the practices that we've used as well. And we're really interested to hear how you're applying these sorts of things in the classroom. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Will. He's going to start us off. But
yeah, so I guess we're going to go through three sort of main themes here. We're going to look at how we sort of arrived at vulnerability and transparency as kind of principles or themes to our teaching that we weren't aware of but were present. We're going to talk about the frameworks that we kind of constructed for ourselves and read about that helped us to understand what that looked like in practice. And we're going to give some case studies, and we're going to kind of solicit some from everyone. So if you're just joining, feel free to join the Menti, just the code's up there. So it begins. James and I met with the intention of looking at a general education subject that we were both intending to teach. This was in term 2, 2022. And this was around the time when the effects of ChatGPT and generative AI were starting to be felt. And both of us felt like it was sort of a pivotal moment. And that AI, generative AI, generally large language models, were provided a sort of provocation to us to think about how we designed our course. And given the kind of trimester model and the pressures of our work, we did a quite rapid redesign of the course around the theme that was really about asking students what the point of university was. The initial vision of the course was a kind of role play where an AI had decided to replace all lecturers, with AI, and we were going to students to ask whether or not they should replace students with AI as well. That we didn't end up going with that. It was a bit too bleak for us to be too real, but it led into a sort of a course that was really about what is the point now, and because we designed it so quickly and we were experimenting quite a lot, we came into the classroom with that very much on our mind, and with that as being something that we're bringing to every single lecture. And we sort of, at a certain point, I'm not sure what moment it was, but we kind of abandoned the efforts at maintaining the sort of veneer of academic authority, I guess it would be, and started to really talk to the students about our process, about our design, the principles behind our design, the sort of reasons that we picked the things that we were. And we were open about saying, look, this is the first time that we've done this course. This is we're working this out, and we want to work it out with you. And both of us really started to realize that this sort of awkwardness and vulnerability, in a sense, because you're admitting to not really always 100% knowing what you're doing, it was actually like a really useful principle to lay out and to get students to reflect upon their own processes. And rather than decreasing our authority, I felt like it increased it, in the sense that we were making explicit a lot of things that weren't necessarily explicit to students. Not just, through the kind of medium of complaints or anything like that, but to really justify a lot of the assessments that we were designing and that we were delivering and that we were marking. And so we started to look for ways to understand this, and we saw that there are conversations in literature that sort of reflect this, and so we found that this was a really useful way to think about it. But there were also some things in literature that didn't so much align with the way we would think about these things, and so that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So I guess this is don't get too deep in terms of nothing traumatic if you unless you're really comfortable talking about it. But what's the most vulnerable you've ever felt in your teaching? What are the vulnerable moments that spring to mind when you think about education and that classroom experience as a lecturer or course designer or whatever? You're welcome to the answers will come up here, but you're also welcome to just tell us. Everyone should be able to hear you.
If you're online, you can just write it on the chat if you like, or if you prefer. Many options.
Actually, I might say one to start with. I can think of many, but I'll just say one. I think that's about credibility. I think that when you start teaching, it may either be an unfamiliar faculty or an unfamiliar course or an unfamiliar level. I think that at some level, as you were saying, you have the authority of being the teacher when you come in, when you walk into the room, but there's also a moment of credibility where students are thinking, why should I believe you if you're saying something different to what I've experienced in terms of education before? Why should I believe that hippie up there, in that sense? And I think that's actually one of the most interesting things about, at some level, you have to have credibility beyond just the systemic, official credibility you have by walking into the room. And often if you're older, it makes a difference, and lots of other things make a difference too. But I think that's really interesting, establishing your credibility in some way. And I think if you say, I'm the teacher, therefore I'm credible, then you've lost people straight away. There's no point in doing that because there's nowhere to go after that. But there is a point where you have to rely on something. Sometimes it's telling a story, or sometimes it's your experience in that area, or sometimes it's the fact that you give across the idea that you know what's going to happen in terms of the course. I think it's really important to do that, but often I think that's the most vulnerable, when you can't work out how am I going to be credible here. I think.
Yeah, I think that's oftentimes the sense of it being a balance, where you, on the one hand, you want to be kind of approachable and so on, and on the other hand, you need to sort of, and I think that's what this point is getting at. When students aren't attending, and you don't know what's talking about the barrier, but you're not sure exactly how to address it. I felt like the most vulnerable, while I use examples from GenY, the most vulnerable I've ever felt teaching is teaching online. Like when you're actually you're there and you have no point of feedback from students at all. There's no dialogue. There's no cameras. It's just blank squares. That's brutal, and that's telling that that's what we think of when we think of vulnerable teaching moments, because there's no dialogue. So you can't appraise how students are perceiving you. You can't. There's no transparency the other way, I guess, in that sense.
I was the one that did that one about students not attending, and actually I was thinking about it after. I think what's really vulnerable for me, like when I'm educating, is that there are things beyond my control that dictate what I can do, and I feel really vulnerable in those moments when I'm not forced to, but I really need to think of how do I frame this for my learners, to say, look, I know this is not ideal. It's not ideal for me either. 10 weeks, not great. It's not a great amount of time. Yeah. But look, this is what I think we can do in 10 weeks. And this is what's in the past. So I guess it's calling out the uncomfortable elephant in the room every time and saying, I know it's there. I'm not going to downplay it, but sometimes I actually can't fix it. And that, I think that's the vulnerable thing, when I can't fix it in a way in the time that I have. And it's really hard because, you can't meet everyone's needs all the time.
Right.
And you have to accept that I'm not meeting some people's needs and I'm only one person. Yeah.
Pretty good, all that. Anyone else?
A couple.
Eye rolls?
Yeah.
I think there's different breeds of eye roll. There's you just used some Gen Z slang wrongly, and then that's a productive one, I feel like, and then that's productive ones.
Trying new strategy, taking a risk. Yeah, that's interesting as well. Trying new things. Absolutely. Yeah, cool.
And so I think like the sort of, I feel like that your response is that transparency, right? When you feel that awkwardness, the response is to kind of narrate or to like present or whatever to bring students into that awkwardness and make it not on the problem and strength, right? And I think that that's always something that we do with the question of authority. It's like I'll talk to students and I'll say, you know, the reason that you might view me as more authoritative is because, you know, I have a beard and I have, you know, you know, I look a particular way, but that's not actually really a great judge of authority. So let's think about what it is that would get respect or not get respect and why that would be in the classroom, right? And so having those conversations, I think, is really a useful thing and something that's ongoing. So I guess one thing that found within, you know, thinking about these things, we went to the literature and we looked at transparency in learning and teaching. And so we're going to get, James is going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we'll look at some different practices of how transparency in learning and teaching applies, but there's sort of two frameworks for it. When we talk about transparency in the literature, we're talking about making the sort of implicit, explicit. So instructions. We're not so much talking about vulnerability or being open and transparent, although that's a part of the transparent pedagogy. But what we did find in the very extensive literature review that we conducted was that it's by no means perfect. And there's a really good article by Maggie Bierman and Ajawi, who writes about this approach to transparency being somewhat sort of difficult to achieve in reality and a bit ambiguous. And there's some interesting research around that. But yeah, most often it's just when we talk about transparency, we're talking about making assessments as transparent and open as possible, which is debatable as to whether or not that works well. Now,
Okay, so can you hear us now? We for whatever reason, we don't have the TV turned off and we have no sounds. But can you hear us? Back. Okay, so this is just our laptop sound. So apologies, we'll try as much as possible to repeat what people in the room say, because it might not get picked up as easily, and we'll just stand.
I won't be able to see the slides, right?
No, they can see if we just close, if we just mute. So I'll just put, minimize that, and then that one as well, and then they should be able to. Hopefully, see the slides, and we're good.
Yeah.
No, the microphone turned off, but it's okay. We've come up with a free solution, so it's okay. Yeah, I think just
should be good for now. Yeah, so I'll skip past the goals of it because I want to use some examples. Why is my thing not working? There we go. So one of the reasons why we sort of have been using this method unknowingly for a while is because a lot of the idea that academics are currently doing is we try to help students understand the things that are sort of tacitly known or tacit knowledge that exists within the university that's not often shared or taught. It's often assumed. And so students often come in their first year not knowing how to do a lot of things, having a lot of expectations, having been taught certain ways of thinking, which then would apply within the university. So some really common things that we are very open and transparent about are some of the myths that students believe when they start. So one of them being read every word on you. The only people that read every word of every article, editors, authors, very rarely is it, other readers. And so students come in thinking that they've got this reading list that they need to do that they're never going to be able to tackle. And so we make that explicit. We say, look, we don't expect you to read every word of every article we're assigning you. That's up to you how much you want to read. You can get a lot of it just, skimming through the abstract and the conclusion. And we teach them reading techniques that all academics use. And so, but prior to that, this knowledge wasn't known. So yes, this is where the value of transparency really comes in handy. Another really common myth is this idea that essays are meant to be objective and students should have no opinion, which is the complete opposite of what we want. And yet we don't often explicitly say that, especially when we write rubrics. Things like, must have a good understanding of or demonstrate sound knowledge. Like, what do those terms even mean? The other thing that's quite common, particularly with first years, is this sort of, I think it's this English advanced thing that comes from the HSC, but it's sort of adding unnecessary complexity to words and sentences to make it sound better, quote unquote, which often has the opposite effect. It ends up, going south. With that.
Realize what was wrong. How can they?
Because that has yeah. So just move this down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where from? There's no sound. There we go. We just keep up with this awkwardness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
You
we
can
still
hear us. Now can you hear us?
It's cool.
Sorry. Okay, sorted. Perfect. Okay. We're just gonna keep this. Was all planned with Lucy in advance. We just made it so that we wanted it to be really awkward, so we just thought we'd stop ourselves.
It could be much worse. You could have just continued with the echo. I've seen that.
We could.
Yeah, also. Yeah, and this idea that like the students actually, a lot of students will think that the marker doesn't care what they think, that they're not interested, and it's like all we're interested in. That's literally like the main thing that we want to see is how they think and what they think about the world. That's the most value to us as educators. So the students come in with these beliefs that that's not. As a first year student, what can I add to the literature? What can I say that's of value? And so we try to, bust these myths, be transparent with the things that we want. And often, again, these are all assumed knowledge that isn't explicitly taught, which sort of is academic skills, sort of bread and butter, is busting those myths. So in terms of transparency in learning and teaching, what we tend to be doing, we as in the university, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just a thing, is we rely a lot on rubrics, learning outcomes, and assessment instructions, which, interestingly enough, are really good AI prompts to cheat with. So if you plug in those things, you're basically giving a large language model the specifics of what that course coordinator wants. And so they've become great cheating methods. And not to scrap learning outcomes rubrics, I think they're really important and often, which Ian talks about in the article I mentioned, which we'll send a link to. Often when students look at the rubrics, it's the only time that they're thinking about the quality of the work required for that course. It's often the very few times that they do that throughout.
Can we get these later? So
I'll send them to Lucy.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And so yeah, so they're still useful. We use them. We use rubrics, but if you're just doing rubrics, then you kind of have to add to that to add to the transparency. Yes.
Do they look at them?
Good question.
I think do, at least in our experience.
They do.
If you again are transparent about how and why they should use them and embed them,
yes,
more likely to realize it's for them, not of them.
Yes, yes. And one of the really important points about rubrics, I think that, and again, going back to this article, it mentions them, is that we often, again, it's the only time students will think about the quality of the course they need to adhere to. But the danger is that they treat the learning outcomes of rubrics as a sort of recipe for success to get good grades. Whereas that's not what we're wanting the rubrics to be. We're wanting the rubrics to be a guideline, like a set of guidelines that they can sort of use and then move away from and go different directions in some ways to sort of see further than the rubric. So that there are problems with these things. And often they're like terms and conditions that yeah, some students won't read. Like I've seen assessment, like as our job will kind of often reveal to us, we look at a lot of assessment outlines, a lot of course instructions students bring into consults. And some of the assessment instructions are 3-4 pages long for a single assessment. Now that may be overdoing transparency, perhaps. Maybe there's too much. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes they'll completely skip the assignment instructions and just bring in the rubric.
Yes, yeah.
And when I said yes enthusiastically, I guess it's because we'll often see students who are, when they have a problem with the assessment, the way that they try to address it is to look at the rubric for like how they bring the rubric because they think that the rubric is a sort of quantifier of what they need to produce. And I think that rubrics as quantifier versus rubrics as qualifier is a distinction that I'm thinking more about lately, in the sense that like I've seen some really great rubrics that were quite helpful to students, but I've also seen a lot that were, again, the sort of a post-hoc justification for a mark that really was not marked in that way. The effort to kind of like have everything broken down is understandable in that it seems transparent. Well, you know, you want to know how you got X marks, but as you know, especially in assessments that are more than summative, like it doesn't necessarily always make sense. And I think that, yeah, but we can kind of talk about that in a little bit.
So the question is, how do you sort of move on these things and still use a transparency pedagogy? What can you do? And so some of the things that I'll talk about are quite useful. I think I mentioned this about not just giving them a checklist or a recipe. But the key here is to give them the rubric. Rubrics are great, but also try to involve them in the learning process. Okay, so something that we did, that's the wrong slide, sorry, is that with the levels of AI assistance that's come out, the sort of 6 lanes of, you know, to do with AI in each assessment task, we actually had students look at this framework and we explained each of the assessments in our course, and we said to them, how much AI do you want to use for each task? Let's vote. And the students justified their approach. They voted collectively, and crazily enough, they aligned with what we would have assigned as educators. And as educators, we're interested in their learning, so we're assigning appropriate levels of AI. And they aligned with what we would have done ourselves. But because students felt part of the process and of the learning, they actually really appreciated that. So there was a feedback from a student that like wrote that the following. So James was clear that he was learning with us, and that AI was something we were all navigating together, because we were. This was 2023, so a few months after ChatGPT. I was engaged with the learning process, or the process of learning, and it heightened my awareness of the acceptance and limitations of AI usage tasks. So giving students the option to vote is risky because they could all, you know. And
that was a vulnerability, right? In that we told them that if they all voted for 100% AI usage, we'd go with it. And I meant that in that I would then have to figure out what that looked like.
Yes.
And that would be something that would be a learning experience. Again, you can't be vulnerable unless, you know, there has to actually be that real vulnerability.
Yeah, the risk taking.
But at the same time, you're trusting them to make those decisions and to think about what they value in the learning. And then suddenly it's not the mark that they're thinking about. Suddenly it's they're thinking about the actual learning rather than what mark they would get. Or maybe they're thinking about, you know, that they might get that they'll get a better mark if we're not assuming that they've got everything. Yeah.
This one you said involve them in the learning process with the rubric. Any examples?
What was that?
The one after that, next.
Involve them in the learning process. Yeah, so that's like showing them the levels of AI assistance and saying, okay, what do you want to use for each assessment is involving them in the learning process. Because now they have to think, okay, so if this task is asking me to do this, then perhaps I shouldn't use AI for it because of this. So we had an essay, a report, learning portfolio. Students saw the use of AI in constructing the learning portfolio as not very helpful because they thought about the learning portfolio, right, which is meant to demonstrate process, understanding, and that's a whole other. But because students thought about it, like critically, they're like, well, yeah, we don't need to use AI to write a learning portfolio because the value of the learning portfolio is doing the learning ourselves and showing our process. And so, yeah, that's sort of, there's many ways you can involve them in the learning process. That was one that we used.
With, I mean, at the moment now, academics need to choose a lane
Yes.
for econ.
Yeah.
And so therefore that opportunity for that conversation
Go down the window.
is gone. But I guess what you're saying is that there's stuff that you have that you decide your assessment or whatever, and there's what's negotiable with your students and building in time for that negotiation as early as possible.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I'm glad you raised that because now the process is that the levels of AI have to be set before the course starts. So that example no longer works. So we were lucky to test it. But there are other examples I'm sure that we'll perhaps talk about.
Like mode or like
how do you learn?
Like, or like, again, you could use the rubric and say, what does it actually mean to have a sophisticated, theme? What things could we do for that and they could all discuss together and then I mean you would hope that they would do that.
You wanted to talk about your example of
I think we get to that.
yeah.
So I guess so
A few slides ahead.
yeah. So I guess like one thing was that we a lot of it's just about like what we hand students, and the assumption I think rightly is do they read, how much of the course code are they reading, how much of this, and so integrating that sort of as principles more generally and that transparency and open as part of the actual course design, it's sort of built in. And so initially it was in a sense it was real, and it's still real, but now at this point there's sort of almost like a performance aspect to it in the initial lecture of the course. So we go through with them talking about how this are the principles that we design the course with. This is the kind of like openness that we have to changing midstream. These are the sort of nuts and bolts of like how we went through designing the course, what the problems were we encountered, and why we chose the things that we did. And so then it's less, in that first lecture, it was something that we were doing because we were actually kind of making it up as we went along to a certain extent. But now that we have that settled upon, that structure, and that, we've kind of refined continually with students, but that is a much more set up now. It's still something that we try and keep that communication with about, just the elements that students seem to really find appealing, which was, things like us actually justifying, we understand that you hate group work. The reason that we do it is for this, and this reason, and then no complaints about group work. All of my experience surveys, like whenever you have group work, I was used to getting, someone complaining about, no one complains about group work anymore. Similarly, the essay, suddenly we had to justify, not just to them, but to ourselves, how we keep an essay in the course in this age of AI. And, knowing how easy it is to get around that, right? And so then that led us to, to talk to them about those things and reframe that, I guess, as something that they have to opt into, which again, you're sort of like abdicating your your position as an authority in a certain sense, as an authority to certify whether or not someone has learned anything. You're saying, well, you need to opt in to learn in the first place. Like, this is what, and we found that, attendance increased the moment that we stopped marking attendance. And all these other things that seem to come from that sort of speaking to them. And so this was the way that I thought about it. It's a great article about Elizabeth Johnson, who uses Judith Butler's kind of conceptualization of vulnerability. They talk about vulnerability as an active performance through which adults might turn fearful responses into opportunities to engage more deeply. So you take that sort of second questioning and then you turn it into something that allows for a moment of engagement, that vulnerability. Yes.
Thanks, Will. I think it's a really interesting point. Coming back to this idea of the first time you taught something, I had a colleague once who said, I only ever teach a course twice and then that's it. And I understand, I mean, having taught courses for many, many years, I understand why, because I agree the first time you teach a course, there's always this high wire act that you're doing because you're not really sure because you haven't got to the end of the journey. But then, as you were saying, the moment now you've done that, you have to now perform this idea of being there with students because you're actually not, because you've been to the end of the roadway and you can see where it gets to. And you know pretty much after a couple of years, you know pretty much every question that people are going to ask about things. So I think that's where the teaching becomes, yeah, I agree. It becomes the performance of being with where the students are at. And I think that's a whole other facet of teaching, which I think is actually quite interesting as part of it. But that's why I think teaching something the first time is the most vulnerable. And I think sometimes you do your best teaching then because you're just ahead of where the students are at and you have no idea what's really going to happen at the end. But then once you know the course, then you have to almost be a different kind of guide. Let's put it that way. You have to be a different guide, I think.
Just acknowledge.
Yeah. And we've tried to sort of, I think one thing that, again, this is something that we sort of did without conceptualizing it in this way, but then afterwards kind of read and sort of had ideas about how to conceptualize it. And I guess like we sort of try to curate moments of where you kind of can't evade that vulnerability. Moments of unpredictability, moments of where the course in general is not in that mode, but we will try to do the things that, you know, the harder parts of work in front of students as part of the transparency about, you know, this is how you do X thing. And so, for example, like last week, I went into my class and I asked the students to choose an essay question for me to answer because I'm asking them to write introductions. And so they gave me an essay question. And then in front of them, I wrote the introduction. I tried to write the introduction. It's hard. It's hard to write into, like, you know, I mean, I've been writing for a very long time. I teach writing, you know, and yet still, obviously, you know, I'm going to be reconstructing my sentences and I have to talk through those mistakes, not just spelling mistakes, but the mistakes in sentence formulation or the way that my argument changes, especially in response. They asked me, I think the question I ended up answering was, you know, what is the Eshe a particularly Sydney subculture? Right? And then I had to come up with an answer on the fly in response to that. Luckily, I knew enough about the topic to kind of do this. But if I hadn't, then I would have to show them parts of how I would reorientate myself in relation to that. Right? And so that showing the process, I think, requires a certain. It's always going to be vulnerable because we're used to sort of, I guess, the defense of being able to show, you know, like our finished products. Right, we're able to show, you know, the art.
You do the same thing with reading.
And that's also applies to reading. So we do it with reading too. Yeah.
Has anyone done an assignment for students of design your own rubric? As like
I think that's definitely been something that's happened. We haven't done that, but it's like a kind of co-curated rubric is something I've seen people do. Yeah, like
I'd be keen to see who's done it and how.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty with it is often administrative.
Well, I mean, maybe it's not the rubric for the course, but the exercise shows them.
Yeah, like how you have to think about where are the boundaries, what's within, like what's possible. You know, like what you can propose as a task, what we can feasibly expect a range of people to do.
Yeah.
Because it's not always like, you know, the top mark needs to be like perfection. Like that's not where it needs to go. And like you say, like if they have to do the work of doing that, they realize, oh, maybe they're not asking me for perfection either. They're asking me for kind of like a relative amount of capability based on where I am, what subject we're doing, whatever. Like, and again, like it just makes visible all of those things that we would think about when we're developing a rubric. Yeah.
I think that we often sometimes like we are live in that many of us won't have done those assessments in a long time. Mm. And when we could, you know, or we haven't done them since AI was a thing, right? And I think that it's just even, you know, taking an assessment that you have and trying to do it using AI tools and seeing how easy it is can be really revealing. And so things like that, like we had what happened to the sharing? Oh, I think we need to still open it up. Yeah. So we set a documentary task with them, with the students as a replacement for what was a presentation. We gave the option to kind of produce a documentary. And then I was sort of like, this seems like maybe it's a hard task. I'll make one to be kind of meta. James and I made one about the design of the assessment that was doing the assessment. So we had a documentary about the assessment in the to kind of teach the assessment. And that like was revealing to me because I'm like, okay, these are the skills that I haven't actually, I'm not marking them on, but I'm expecting them to have. I'm not,
Yes.
but like, you know, these are the things that I'm like, are actually part of this that we don't have any direct instruction of. And I think that that's something that is with even an essay, you know, how much are we assuming, you know, in terms of skills and so on. And so I think that that sort of like going along with it is part of that. And that was something that I feel like, because this was Gen My 0003, which is a subsequent course, like the next term, and it seemed like it was still a thing, and it was something that seemed to have the benefit of really giving students. I mean, in the last presentation we did on this, the student talked about how they felt like they enjoyed thinking along with us because we were making that thinking process very clear, very explicit. And you know, when I'm reading, you know, I say like I've read this sentence 3 times and I still don't quite understand. So I think that maybe the problems with the sentence structure, and then this is how I would sort of reconceptualize it, or whatever. Things that they probably, you know, generally aren't quite used to seeing, but that really we assume that they learn because we learned it by trial and error, which is not ideal. And so we sort of kind of sketched out some principles that we sort of would bring to this process, but weren't necessarily explicit about. In that we look at like the process, not just of, you know, we're not just looking at assessing process, but also that we wanted to talk about how we designed them and why we use them. Like, so for example, I teach the fact that the essay, the reason that we still set essays is because it's about teaching a particularly valuable type of thinking. It's not about the end product of the essay. It's not about that finished piece of writing that you can produce with ChatGPT. It's about you internalizing that process of ordering information and making an argument. And again, after we did that, like their investments seemed to increase in that because they realized, okay, well, I'm kind of getting around this. And so also involving students in ongoing dialogue as part of the process of design and redesign. So I'll have, you know, choose your own adventure in the middle of the tutorial where they get to choose what they do. So, you know, do they, and by and large, they often will choose the kind of modeling things that we talk about. So getting us to read in front of them, getting us to write in front of them, those are things that students really value. And also, you know, it can allow you to have, like, if you, I'll have a bunch of slides on different topics prepared in advance, and then I just swap them in, and it doesn't kind of, it's no extra work really. And yeah, the like fact that we model flaws, like I think is something that I've just been really leaning into, not to the extent of oversharing, but like, you know, just kind of the mistakes and all of those things as being part of our process and being really, really important, you know, as something that we don't come fully formed. And then that forces a reconceptualization of what we're really marking them for. And I think did a lot of this, you know, open some more questions about assessment, things like that. On everybody's mind, I'm sure. And I guess like there's a reflexivity that we try to bring to that. So, you know, thinking about what you assume, thinking about what, you know, skills you're looking for, how you mark them, and so on. What are you marking when you mark this? You know, is it critical thinking? And if so, how do you, you know, is that realistic? Is that what you're actually assessing when you see that finished product? And so on. Especially because, you know, with AI, most of them, if they aren't writing the essay with AI, they're getting ideas from AI. And so they'll give the AI the question and see what answer it does, and then they'll memorize it and then write the essay. So then, you know, what that creates a new question about, you know, what's the difference between that and, you know, them reading a really great article on the same topic. So I guess this was the kind of goal, this kind of feedback was part of the goal of this, in that we wanted it to create a sense of, you know, like an equitable environment in that people were able to speak their minds and that it was sort of a community that were learning together, even though there was still that distinction in terms of me doing expert modeling, in that like when I do a lecture, that's what my lecture is. I'm modeling expert thinking for them, right? And when we do the writing, same thing, right? But that we're still sort of part of that shared community. And I guess like we wanted to ask what the most pressing challenge for your teaching is today, to think about ways that you might already be addressing it. You already sort of did that with the, you know, that transparency or vulnerability can kind of address some of these things.
We'll see, yeah.
We'll see what. Put,
What is the most pressing challenge for your teaching today? If you want to write your answers on Menti or share them here or online, you can put them in the chat.
just the word cloud, so it would just be one.
Oh, word cloud. Oh, okay, one word answers. All right. So enter your responses, or yeah, share them audibly if you wish.
Got one, but it's not one word.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think you can do that.
Something you said earlier, it's that transforming from them being into the destination and realizing the value of the journey. What actual, like, I see the vulnerability one and the changing of the power structure is one of the ways you keep them off balance on that. But what are the narratives you use to get the value of the journey through to them?
I guess we both pitch it and assess it. Right? So there's an aspect of motivation that we have this thing called the learning portfolio that we say, you know, the goal of the learning portfolio is to collect the artifacts of their thinking. So collect the kind of detritus that they produce through the process of work. In class, outside of class, lecture notes, you know, tutorial notes, conversations, like people include WhatsApp, you know, WhatsApp conversations that they were having about the course. They include, you know, filmed dialogues, a bunch of random stuff like that. And the goal of that is really to get them to think about their process and to emphasize that. And so, and the other part is really to sort of pitch the value of that, to say that we understand that, you know, the value of an essay, like if you consider the value of the essay as being the ability to produce that end product, that's, and that you can bypass that very easily, then that's not just a problem for us as educators, that's a problem for you as people who are then going out into the world, not really being able to do anything. In that if somebody else can do it, if a computer can do it very easily, then you know, you've lost that value, right? And now it's a question for both of us.
Yeah.
And so I guess trying to foster that investment in it through that was something that, again, vulnerability, I don't know if students would buy it, right? I didn't know if they would be on board for that, but it did seem like because they kept coming to class and they kept, you know, like repeating that kind of, that sort of understanding, they seemed to want to do those. It made the assignments more achievable in a sense. So that's, I guess, yeah. But
there's some responses that have come in. So competing for attention.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, I would say a really, really big one. Yeah, mark-oriented students, so grading, uninterested, the workload, I guess that's both for staff and students. Attendance rates, lack of support, lack of thinking time, and time to differentiate. Yeah, there's some interesting ones there actually.
I mean, the emphasis on workload is interesting. I think it's like both student and like staff workload. It could be either. But at least two people have said it. I think that the attention thing is something that we've found. I mean, I can say I really want to come to the lectures. Like I've heard that they're good, but I only have one class on that day, and I live in. Like I'm not going to come. And you know, there's a bunch of structural things that, as you say, it's not really anything you can do around that, right? Like, and because I talked to them about the value of the lecture, it's not just the information delivery, it's that it's a dialogue. And you will lose that dialogue if there's no students present, right?
I mean, there's a trade-off. I did an observation of a class the other week, and the students were really engaged. And I think there was a variety of reasons. Like it was a small cohort, it was a non-core subject kind of elective, but they had their lecture directly before.
Yeah.
Tutorial,
Yeah, so they had the lecture directly before and 2 tutorials after. It's a very small cohort, only 50 students. So when it's something like that, like I think it's totally achievable. When we're dealing with some of these courses at massive scale, like that opportunity is taken away from the educator to have that kind of, I don't want to say captive audience, but like it is a captive audience, you know, like because you can structurally put it together in a way that they can think about something and apply something directly. And I think the pedagogical kind of justification for, I'll give you some information earlier in the week and we'll apply it later in the week, I think that the logic tracks. But if you only supply that information in a synchronous way earlier in the week, your course design is based on an incorrect assumption.
About memory and things like that.
But also about people actually engaging with that content. that that they just that like it's less of a easy group to kind of get the first content and the second content, because we don't have students, and we shouldn't be thinking about students as people that are here for the time. They're just not. Our students are the most, and us, that are the busiest level of society that it hasn't ever been. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's something that requires kind of reconceptualization, because most of us studied at a different time. But I think that what we've found is that this sort of approach, just making a learning portfolio rather than assessing participation, did lead to attendance, right? And I have feedback where students would say, this was the only reason I came to campus. I only came to campus for these tutorials.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have gone otherwise, right? As a positive thing, in that led to a motivation to be more attentive, because they understood it not as something that they would sort of have to rote learn and then deliver back, but as where they were sort of part of learning skills. I think there's also a sort of time specific thing in that we lost a lot with COVID, we lost a lot of habits with COVID, and so just having points where we get the students to just talk to each other. It's an idea James had, where we just in the first 5 minutes of the lecture, we just talk to each other about whatever. Timing, was that a hand up or?
Yeah, I think that it's true. This is what I think is one of the best things about Gen Ed courses. So I know that for most faculties, Gen Ed courses, they make money for you. At that level. But I think it's actually, partly I'm biased because I started to teach through doing quite a few Gen Ed courses, but I think it's a great opportunity to do all these things, because it's not a core course. It's something where you can actually get students in doing things, and they're not so fussed about the mark, although some see it as a wham booster and all that sort of stuff. But you actually have the ability to do it where when you have big first year, 1,000 students or 500 students, big coverage course where you just have to cover, material, whether students have learned or not, does not matter, but you have to cover it. I think that unfortunately that all those comments are exactly right. There's a lot more pressure on teaching staff, and you have to find the little gaps where you can actually draw people in. But also I think, that's where I think Gen Ed is, I think it's a really missed opportunity. It has been a missed opportunity for 30 years, so I don't, but I think this is what you're doing, I think, in trying to do something different with it. I think admittedly having smaller classes also works. It can be a big difference because you can make that connection with people. But I think that this, to me, is where Gen Ed is really, really good as part of the, what New South, does in terms of learning. So.
But actually, on that point as well, I was a student at UNSW many years ago. I did my Gen Eds in my 3rd/4th year, I think. And if you look at it from that perspective, if this is actually making visible the hidden curriculum, is it really actually those formal things? Should the Gen Eds be done?
It's a big discussion exactly about that at the moment, but yeah, I think that's exactly right.
I think that, because I think there are advantages to a Gen Ed in terms of not least having people from different disciplines. You can teach to that difference to get them to talk to each other and so on. But I think that a lot of these things are things that are scalable, in the sense that the reading modeling and things like that. I did them in the first time I did reading modeling was in a very large undergraduate course at ANU, and it was not necessarily costing any more time. A lot of these things, the learning portfolios, would be completely scalable because it's exactly this. It's just a different thing. And I think oftentimes not designing with those things in mind end up costing time in other ways. It's something I'm very sure most of you are conscious of, is how much time we're losing to policing AI. At least sometimes, you're losing a lot of time having to try and figure out, to sort of ways to ensure the integrity of an assessment or whatever, because that's something that if you don't design for, then later on you're going to have a lot of conversations with students about, something's obviously require a computer.
This is something that I did. So I went to a tilt workshop, probably 2 years ago, I think. And from then was using those principles in the assessment guide. But then with the kind of advent of AI and everything kind of coming out, I just made more and more visible the process of doing the assignment, to the point where I was like, just document this process as you do it and submit that as an appendix. And we're not going to have a conversation at all. Because I only did that because I think it was probably mid last year, one of the students was like, you know what, the fact that you told us how to research and the steps to do it, and it was pretty high level conversation. And so each term I just gave more and more kind of suggestions or tips around it. And then it got to the point where I was like, if you follow this process, you're going to get this output.
Yeah.
But you need to document the process and just put it in there as well. And then I'm not having a conversation because I know that you did the process to get the output.
Yeah, that's sort of a good example of like the explicit instruction pedagogy, which has become really popular recently, especially in like low socioeconomic high schools where they're really struggling. Just telling students like how to do stuff is actually a really effective way of getting them to do stuff. Funnily enough, often we.
Because otherwise, like we assume, like it's like a guessing game.
Yeah, it is exactly right.
Like,
That's supposed to be the learning.
Fair.
Yeah,
What about
to guess correctly as a
Yeah.
part of like demonstrating their learning, like work this out and learn.
Yeah, and
Right.
you didn't know to do it this
Yeah.
way, but I never told you that.
Exactly, and that's
Yeah.
that's the hidden curriculum which
Yeah.
we try to sell in the course. But yeah, it sounds like you're doing great things with the transparency approach. So
I mean, it worked. I did.
Yeah, I think
I
it
had
works.
like 0 conversations on that assignment.
yeah,
Can I just add something to that? And that's, I think the question is, where do you allow students to be behind the scenes and having to make their own decisions about how to do the assignment, for example?
Yeah.
Or where do you say step 1, step 2, step 122, etc.? And
that's the line.
where, yeah, because to me it's like, well, okay, there's got to be space for students to make their own decisions about it. But I agree with you. You have to say, okay, what is an essay like at university? And look, there are thousands of documents which say what an essay is like.
Yeah.
There have been for 70, well, at least in my, 35 years, definitely.
Yeah.
Some are phrased better than others, without doubt. Some are taught better than others, without doubt. But I think that is, and I think it is different for different courses.
Depending what you do and how much time. So it was 7 principal steps. It was like you need to collect first, and you might collect like, and this is what you do. Then you need to kind of, make sure it's credible. Do the crap test or whatever. But I was like, I don't really care what you collect or where you get it from, but you need to start with collecting.
Yeah,
And then you need to. So it was like 7 kind of principal
Journal.
steps. And then I was like, but you can do what you want. And then like the 4th step was like, you need to start at this point generating a draft. You need to have like 4 drafts by the end. I don't care how long they are, but you need to have a variety of them so you can compare between them. But like, I don't care how you do it. But like, if you don't, if you're doing this assignment and you think I can do this 3 hours before it's due, it's like we actually, I mean, you could, but you're going to get to draft. You're not going to get to synthesis. And that's why. But yeah, so trying to keep it, like you said, like still give them choice. But what I tried to do was every time I had a question about the assignment, which I thought was really valid, like I answered it and created a resource about it and then made it available for the future students. So I was like, someone in the past has said this, you can use this if you want, you don't have to. But then it just, over time, it cut down on the questions that they had. But even, yeah, I would run a briefing and I would model. And I would say, like, if you're going to start a reflective assignment, this is how I would do it. And I'm like, if you're like me, like I freak out like at a blank page. So I just start with dictation because then there's words on the page and I can edit. And then I'm not generating, I'm editing. And I feel I'm capable of that. So just modeling any part of that process without saying you have to do this.
I think we're nearly at time.
Yeah,
Do you want to have a question or what was the last one? Yeah, we addressed that.
We've already kind of addressed that. So I guess like, we stuff up, we'll hang around for questions. If anyone has any, you can just ask them on the Minty or person, if anyone online has any questions. But yeah, otherwise, like, I think that we've kind of covered the things that we really wanted to get out.
Yeah, I think like Dom raised a good point about some of the limitations of the transparency approach. Obviously, there's some challenges to it, and we'll send through that article that sort of critiques it because it's by no means a perfect method, but there's definitely something within it that resonates with students, and I think it helps them get involved in the learning process and see the value of it. And it's something that we can all, we're probably all doing subconsciously anyway. So yeah, question.
When you did the word cloud, a lot of those are a bit bandwidth issues of students as well as faculty. In this approach, what would you leave out?
If we had to like,
Well, I mean, by using this approach, what do you not take up bandwidth with is my question. So what do you leave out of the room and out of the teaching process that makes a little more space for the way that you do go forward?
I think that it shifts our focus from quantifying to qualifying, in the sense that like it does encourage a certain, like, I have to put back on how easy I mark, I guess, in that like you're suddenly confronted with all of the flaws of students' work, but also with the difficulty of this of students' work. And so that they're kind of like holding them to a rubric becomes a lot harder if you think about the rubric in those quantifying terms. And so I guess like it's like, you know, when you think about what can we change to pass fail, you know, in order to encourage that, like not that pass fail encourages a lesser quality of work. In fact, sometimes it encourages a higher quality because, you know, in order to pass, it's better. It's not just that, you know, it's not just a stand-in for if you get more than 50, you pass. And so, yeah, but thinking about that, I guess, I think that's what we sort of lose is that like in a place where there's a kind of, where we think about ourselves as certifiers of knowledge, that you lose out on the sort of like, I guess, that performance of certification. Does that sort of get at what you're saying? But what would you say?
Say it actually, rather than thinking what I have to give up for it, what do I gain using it? And
I was actually asking about mechanics to about that are not helpful to this.
It's something that I reckon that sometimes what you lose in a kind of pedagogical sense is lecture material, let's say, where you're saying, okay, there are 5 different ways of thinking about this topic. First topic is this: when you just talk, because you've read 20 or 30 articles and you know the student's not going to, so you can just say that there are 5 main areas, you can't do 5.
Yeah.
You say, right, there's one main area here, this is the main area we're going to talk at, let's focus on this. So all those other things, you have to lose basically content, I would suggest, or the students themselves, you're relying on them to gain that kind of content in another way. I think that's what that's from what I can see, because in terms of time in a lecture, for example, well, you can't just say, right, there are 5, let's just walk through them in the, et cetera, on the PowerPoint slide and people write them down or whatever they do. You can only do the one. That'd be my.
I think that's exactly that's the answer that I should have given, in the sense that like that's in terms of practically what we've cut is coverage of content, in the sense that like, but I've been okay with that. And the reason I've been okay with that is because I felt like that the content that we did deliver was delivered in a way that where there would be retention and where it would be useful, as opposed to just the sense of like just covering everything. And I didn't feel like we were like, you know, when we were getting them to, you know, spending less time kind of going through everything, I felt like most of them weren't, A, they didn't want to really find it that useful, so they didn't show up. And B, like, you know, if they did show up, then they weren't necessarily retaining any of it. They weren't, their approach to note taking is often, you know, transcription. And so the retention is just limited. Like I would have conversations and it would be like, you know, there would be very, like from very early on, I learned this habit of asking students, you know, what are 3 main takeaways from my lecture? And sometimes it was humbling.
The wrap up your
yeah, feel free to come along to future workshops and send us any questions. Details will be sent by yeah. So should I
I don't think it was a student.